think as we get more and more advanced with AI over time, if we're making very quick progression, there's going to be this convergent pressure where every company that builds a tool that is serving a human within like a function or a role is going to start feeling this pressure to pivot toward building, let's say, the agent or the automated system that does the job of that human.
Welcome to Platform Builders, the podcast for leaders in software development to talk about the future of SaaS. I'm your host, Christine Spang, CEO of Nihilus, and I'm here with my co-host, Isaac Nassimi, our head of product. Each week, we'll be interviewing different builders to discuss the magic of software development. Platform Builders is brought to you by HeavyBit, the leading investor in developer startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, send us a DM on LinkedIn. Cool. So just to kind of dive into things, so you've been building this company called Affinity. The website's affinity.co, and you really started Affinity basically right out of college, yeah?
Yes, yeah, about a decade ago. I think I finished 2 years of undergrad studying computer science, and then I guess a combo of serendipity and intention happened, and then here we are.
Nice. Did you actually drop out in the middle of your degree?
I did, yeah. So I did computer science at Stanford, where I met my co-founders, I guess. And they have a very lenient policy generally. I was personally surprised, but also not really, just given how many companies have come out of Stanford. But they make it both very easy and very risk-free to do that. So I guess technically I am a dropout. Yeah.
That's deep entrepreneur cred to be a dropout. Sometimes I'm jealous actually because I finished my degree and I don't have that cred. But were you attracted to Stanford because of the strong culture of entrepreneurship, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. So before I started college, I was choosing between Stanford or Wharton, of all places, and I don't know. There's some points in your life, maybe your career, where it's very clear that you're at a fork in the road. There's some decisions where there's not.
You almost went to B school.
Exactly. Yeah. That was a point where I was like, man, either of these two choices could lead to a very different version of Ray. But no, I think the entrepreneurial gene was always there. I grew up in a family of founders. Actually, I came to the US in the first place because my dad, who used to work in academia, he was a physics professor in Singapore. In around the year 2000, back when the dot-com boom was happening, he was like, I'm going to go out, strike it, and try to build a company out in Silicon Valley. So there was a bit of that entrepreneurial gene. I think there also was an element of just being around the area. I'm kind of a Bay Area lifer. I spent my whole life within a small perimeter around San Francisco. The year that I graduated high school, I think Peter Thiel was teaching his CS 183 startups class on campus, and that's when I was trying to figure out okay, where do I choose to go to school, and did some trips out there and listened to that class, and I was just wow, I've been standing on the edge of this very interesting ecosystem of founders and builders, entrepreneurs doing things, and I never really took a formal step in since I was so laser focused on just the question of how do you get into college in the first place. And I don't know, there's something that really stood out to me about it. Before college, I spent a lot of time working in a wet lab. You guys know what that is? Biology lab, a wet lab. It's very different from building software. Yeah. Well, the hard thing about doing bioscience in general is it's very slow. Typically, maybe within today it's a bit of a different equation. But you also you have to always wait for permission to do things. You'd be okay, I'm gonna run my experiment, and wait for 2 hours, get my turn to the PCR machine. You realize you screwed something up in the middle of it and have to restart. When I started programming and writing code and everything like that, I was wow, this is amazing. This is I don't have to wait for any permission to do something like that. If you have an idea, you can just immediately build it, right? And that coincided with when this Peter Thiel class was happening. I think I probably watched The Social Network for the first time.
Peter Thiel actually taught at Stanford?
He did, yeah. Actually,
wow, sweet.
Yeah, he has that famous book, 0 to 1.
0 to 1, yeah.
Yeah, so the material for that book actually I think came directly from, there was some diligent student in the audience who took verbatim notes on every single word that he had said. Um, and then that ended up, turning in. He was like, "Wow, this is really well documented set of notes." And then they ended up co-writing the book together. So yeah.
That's
Anyways, it
funny.
was just like weird
Are
jump
you
there.
saying that an AI could have written that book these days if you just took
Probably.
good enough notes?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't see why not. But back then, different question, and I don't know. People were a little bit less, I guess, bullish on AI than they are now. And then there was also like an element of like ending up, I don't know, like being in sort of this, I guess, the continuing to be in like the Silicon Valley sphere. Like I just found so much energy, like this eternal optimism that I felt people had here. And again, it was weird because it was like my backyard. I grew up not that far away from
Hmm.
campus, but those were like the confluence of factors. They ended up making me realize like, wow, this could be interesting. And yeah, ended up deciding to go down the path that was very different from like the business school or like the Wharton path.
Well, you may have saved your soul with that one. Uh, when you were at Stanford, like, what made you make the jump? Did you like just find people that you really gelled with? Like, was it the idea? Like, it's kind of a big deal to be like, well, I'm halfway through my college degree, and like, wow, I think this is a better idea.
Yeah.
Also, did you feel any pressure to find a business and to start as well in the
No,
culture?
not at all. Yeah. So it's interesting. So I guess the founding story of Affinity, I think, was a combination of both intention and serendipity. Actually, maybe let me start by a very high level introducing like, what Affinity is. So Affinity, we basically build relationship management, what we call relationship intelligence software for the financial services industry. So in particular, when you think about folks like venture capital investors, private equity investors, banks, et cetera, like basically what these people do for the large part is they allocate capital, they make investments in private companies, and they manage relationships for a living. That's essentially the core of what they do, right? I did not come from a background in financial services. Like maybe ironically, actually, maybe I would have, if I'd gone to University of Pennsylvania instead. Um, so that's why I say it was both intent and serendipity. Like the intent came from the fact that one coming in, I was like, the Silicon Valley bug had bit me. I was like very passionate about building things. Um, I got to know my then roommate, now co-founder, Shubham. He's phenomenal, and we basically bonded in our first year of college together, just building a ton of things. Like it was like every minute that we weren't spending like doing a problem set or studying for a test, we'd just be like hacking on something on the side. It was kind of weird because like you're trying to finish like writing the code for the assignment so you can like have more time writing code for the for the side project. And that was how I got to know him a lot better. There was a weird like inverse correlation with like things that we worked on where the seriousness of the idea was inversely correlated with the success. So the less serious the idea was, the more successful it seemed to be. Like one funny thing that we talked about like, was like back in the day we built this our most like viral app that we built was this predecessor to TikTok, but it was only good for making one kind of video, and that was it. And it had its like brief moment of fame on the internet where it went viral, and we're like, yeah, that's cool, but that can never be a company, obviously, right? So that was one element. We were building things. We were definitely building things a lot. We also weren't interested, I would say, in like just being founders for the sake of being founders. Actually, one thing that I personally connected a lot with him, just on a core values perspective. And this guy, like, he's like came from the other side of the world. He like grew up in India and came over here. But I think one thing that drew us together was realizing, we were both like motivated, maybe not just by the pure, but by our craft or purely our craft, right? But by our cause. It's like, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting dichotomy for thinking about these things. Like, you could be driven to say, like, my singular goal is to be the best product leader, the best whatever. And that's what I'm driven to do. And frankly, I think a lot of like the K through 12 education system tries to push you into that. For us, we ask the question of like, what are problems that are worth working on? That you could really spend a lifetime, like, just, working really hard on, that are going to make a really big difference. And so we had, I think, like those elements that kind of maybe led us to have some of that like generally founder like gene where it was likely we're going to build a company. The serendipity part of it was when we were in college through total chance. We went to this talk that was at the time being done by Joe Lonsdale and Drew Oetting. They were leading a fund back then. It was called Formation 8. Now it's called APC. It's an extraordinary firm. Christina, I mean, they're big investors in Nihilus. And
Yeah, Formation 8 also invested in Nihilus.
yep, yeah. So what happened was, Joe and Drew, they came to campus. They gave a talk, and back then they were talking about this concept called the smart enterprise, which was at the
I
time.
remember the Smart Enterprise.
Yeah, yeah.
Joe wrote that article.
He did, yeah. Um, it was basically talking about vertical SaaS. That was before like vertical SaaS like had a name,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they coined the term technically. I guess like the name didn't stick, but the concept still stuck. And we thought that was fascinating. So like we got to know them afterward, and one conversation led to another. I think somehow or another they had heard that we had built a lot of things, and I don't know, somehow word probably got to them at some point, and so we got to know them a lot better, and they ended up making like the introductions initially. That ended up snowballing into Affinity, the idea. So it was like there was one summer where it was like one intro compounded to like 10. We ended
Mm-hmm.
up talking, in the summer before we founded Affinity, to probably hundreds of people across financial professional services, where all they did was build relationships for a living. And that led slowly to the realization of, wow, there's like a really interesting company to be built here. There is a way to do things that's probably 10 times better, even though it requires a bit of a counterintuitive leap of faith. I'm happy to talk about that in a minute. But that's how the company got started. So you could say, like, if we didn't maybe go to that talk, like maybe the company would have been started. I don't know. Who knows? But yeah, definitely a combination of both intent and luck.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like there was like, one part intentionality in that, like, you and your co-founder were like, had decided that like you love building things and you want to find something that's worth building. So there was like a little bit of an intentional element of looking for the right thing. But it also sounds like you kind of like followed your curiosity a little bit, like talking to people, building things, just going from one thing to the next and having a lot of conversations and like iterating until you sort of found something that seemed like it was something that could actually be a company.
Yeah. I actually think that's like really prescient. I think there's like a good lesson buried in there. When I think about, we probably made a million mistakes as we were starting off. One of the things we did do right was we were really obsessed with like focusing on the problem and not on the solution. I think like a lot of founders get it wrong, or they kind of mix it up the other way around. They're like, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if X happened? And then they work backwards from there to figure out like what is the thing they could direct that like X towards solving. And
Mm-hmm.
that tends to be a lot less. It can still work, like every company has a hypothesis. There's no mandate as to whether an hypothesis will be right or wrong. You can follow all the best practices and still get to an incorrect hypothesis, or you can break all the rules and still get to the right hypothesis, right? But one thing that correlates well, I think, with like landing on a good idea is like you obsess with the problem. And so, again, we were outsiders to the folks, the industries that we talked to. We're like, we don't know how like a VC makes money, or like what is a limited partner, how do they raise money? We none of those ideas. It was through like just talking to folks and like really obsessively figuring out what are they currently doing, like how is it working for them. If it's not working, why is that not working? We just kept pulling that thread, and that curiosity, I think, ended up leading us to the insights that inspired the company.
Totally. Yeah, I think people really underestimate how much just like the foundation for like doing something is actually interest. It's like being like deeply interested in what are the problems out there and how things work. And then like
100%.
that's like the driving motivation in moving forward.
Ray, I'd love to know a little bit more about kind of the journey at Affinity and growing it, growing pains, maybe anything you ran into during scaling. And I can't remember who talks about it, but like the threes and tens, every time you triple your business, basically everything breaks. Love to hear about some of those breakages and how you're able to get past them.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, I feel like there's a million stories that we could kind of go through there. Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't think this is anything, I guess, super novel, but I think of like the company in a couple of stages. So in the initial stage, there's this obsession with like just finding product market fit. Um, a lot of that is like, as a founder, you're doing everything hands on yourself. So I guess you asked about the scale phase, but like basically, I think the impetus of that phase is while the early team is doing everything personally, uh, you know, trying to figure out how to sell customers, service them, what's the right like initial feature set, what's the initial wedge. It's basically setting the foundation for the scale phase. So I don't know, for me and my co-founder, when we were like involved in every single like customer onboarding, we were obsessively spending time with our customers in the very beginning. The learnings from that ended up becoming the playbook that we then had to figure out, like, okay, if you can do it with like two people, or let's say like two founders, who have a lot of context, and like the early business team, like how do you scale that to 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, etc. So a lot of ways in which that ended up ended up having to figure that out. It was everything from like creating training programs, hiring the right folks. I would say the experience of it all was, as a first time founder, we didn't necessarily have like, we didn't have the prior experience, like the y-intercept, I guess, compared to different from slope, but like the y-intercept of having seen like this happen many times. And so it personally felt like, every single new thing that we were coming up against was, it was a fundamentally new kind of challenge. So yeah, I mean, I guess I can go into any number of like kind of different rabbit holes here, but like, how do we scale like, recruiting? How do we take that and build a machine and engine out of it? How do we scale, the way that we onboarded customers, build a machine out of that? Probably the common pattern was for all these things, we had to really go from a roll up your sleeves and do it yourself kind of mentality to essentially how do you like orchestrate a machine, and how do you like make sure you have the right analytics in place to measure like every step along the way. Because many things, for example, whether you're thinking about sales or fundraising or recruiting, can be thought of as an example as a funnel, right? And so there's common like techniques for how do you instrument that and make sure you're measuring all the right inputs and outputs and whatnot. So
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, what you're talking about is over the time span in the last 10 years. And I think people forget how much even over 10 years things have changed, right? Even doing simple things, there's today things that are simple like A/B testing was a little hard then, right? I think Optimizely was like just coming
yes,
online,
yeah,
right? Analytics, HR, everything. The way we have a million point solutions that we stitch together into this kind of tech stack of the business operationally and also like product wise, it just wasn't there.
totally, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting actually. I think funnily enough, you know, uh, on one hand, like yeah, like some of those tools were super super critical. For example, in like kind of the finding product market fit phase for our company, like I don't think we would have gotten there if it weren't for this whole slew of analytics tools that helped us like really hone in on what were like the moments, the points that would hook a customer and like turn them into like very loyal customers like going forward. That was really critical. I think, funnily enough, though, one interesting thing about what I've seen shift in how like buyers have changed their mindsets is we have too many point solutions. There's like when there's a million ways to like do a certain thing. Like I think generally, as a shift, this has certainly been true in private capital where we operate. What we've seen is like people want to consolidate more, and so this increasing expectation that all the things you do need to do to scale your business, whoever you happen to be serving, instead of buying like a bunch of different tools, like want to buy a single platform tool, and the expectation for each tool is that it should have the functionality of all the other tools that are adjacent to it. That's happened both like vertically, for us, for example, in financial services, but it's also happened, I think, across a bunch of other horizontal like spaces as well.
What do you think the termination point of that is? Like in 10 years, is there just like three tools that do absolutely everything?
Uh, in 10 years is tough actually, yeah, because I feel you're kind of making the assumption there that all the prior assumptions that we had are going to continue, which is
Mm.
SaaS continues to be just SaaS as it was in the last like decade. But I actually think a lot of this like stuff that's happening currently in AI is going to fundamentally change a lot of that. So we're kind of standing at like the cusp of this next inflection, this like next disruption that will kind of rejigger the way that people think about things altogether. If you were to extrapolate, though, that's what I believe. Yeah, so um, on one hand, you see that in the vertical world, right? Like when people talk about, we were talking about earlier about smart enterprise, vertical SaaS. I mean, at this point, there's basically become this like vertical SaaS, not just expectation, but playbook for consolidation of all the tools and technology that a vertical happens to use. I think Bessemer did a really good set of articles on this, but they call it kind of like the layer cake strategy, where you kind of start with one module. Ideally, it's a system of record module where you're kind of like the database that stores like the most important data. And then over time, all the other things adjacent to it that the customer that you serve needs, you end up migrating into the space. So you consolidate all of that into a single tool. So the number of items in the P&L for any of these like companies like just gets smaller and smaller over time. And very often, like those tools have this like 1 + 1 = 3 kind of effect, where like it's better to have like two things living in one tool that are like natively and directly integrated versus like having to log in a bunch of different systems, and some of the synergies don't really quite come out. That's certainly been the case for Affinity. That's essentially one of the guiding north stars for our current product strategy. But it's also true for horizontal things. Like I don't know. For instance, maybe 5 years ago, I mean, close to the start of the company, for instance, like we used Gong in order to like record customer and sales conversations, and analyze them post facto. We would use a separate tool to do our product analytics. We used a separate tool. I think it was called Full Story at the time, to like measure and record session replays for our users, see what they're doing in the app. Now all of these tools are like all consolidating. They're all competing with each other. Like SalesLoft does like all of the recording stuff. Gong does more of the enablement stuff. Like it's all like converged into a much more direct fight. So I think it's very much like an industry wide trend.
I absolutely agree. I mean, at Nihilus, we're kind of coming to the conclusion that everything is slowly becoming a CRM, right? Even things that you wouldn't have considered a CRM before. Chart Mogul's making a CRM. Gong is building a CRM. And I mean, even them, because they're, these types of applications are our customers. Like we're seeing them, have these same exact predilections where they want to try and bundle, right? They want to buy email and calendar from the same provider, and now that we're providing meeting recordings as well, they want to buy those from the same provider. And I mean, we're able to even offer these little tiny like product delights as well because they're in the same place, because we don't have to talk to someone else. So yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I really agree. But rewinding back a little bit, you talked about how the thing that we're on the precipice of, the whole AI world, could really really change and shake up what we consider the SaaS market today. There's a really big probability cloud there, right? I think it
yeah,
could go a lot of different directions. What do you think that actually looks like if you had to choose one path?
yeah. Man, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Thought a lot about this, and I have this whole theory about like where how all this is going to evolve. So let's see, where do I start? Actually, maybe the first thing I'll say, I want to comment on something you said earlier because I think it'll be relevant in a moment. You talked about like a lot of these companies are essentially becoming CRMs. It's not surprising to me. Like in the world of when you think about like what is the stickiest flavor of a SaaS product, they tend to be these very entrenched systems of record, right? Like when you have all of your data sitting inside an Affinity or sitting inside a NetSuite or something like that, it's just a really large pain to like evict that data and move it onto a new platform. And so that's what makes these like things so sticky. That's why their net retention is so high. Those are probably the products, for instance, in the last few years when some of the venture bubble like had popped and interest rates started rising and everything, where that kind of revealed who were like the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves. And it was probably like the systems of record that were the must-haves. That said, one thing I will say generally about like CRMs is no one enters data for the sake of entering data. You think about it, like it's not like there's some mandate of like, oh, you must enter the data or else something terrible happens. It's more you're putting data into, let's say, a CRM because you're going to get value out of it later down the line. Who knows when, right? But it's kind of like an investment. You're paying up front because it's going to help you in some future state when you have to go back and check the data or get some analytics from it or something like that, right? So the AI thing is a really interesting question, and specifically what's hard, I think today, I think this is both true from a founder builder perspective and from an investor perspective because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Is it's very hard to think about like where does the future of the market go and like how do you choose good problems? Like how do you think about problem selection, right? In a weird way, like starting a company or thinking about what to invest in or build today is like way harder than it was 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, like the ground underneath our feet wasn't shifting nearly as fast. It was a lot more stable. Whereas right now, and I don't know, maybe I'm just, overly influenced being in Silicon Valley, but like, what's the timeline for, generally intelligent, super intelligent AI? Like, we don't know. Maybe that's like 3 years away, 5 years away, 10 years away, 50 years away, or maybe it's never going to happen in our lifetimes. Like the three of us will be dead by the time it happens, right? The thing that's hard, and you talked about this probability cloud idea, Isaac. That's the root of it, is that we're not sure. The uncertainty is what makes it difficult, right? Now, how do you think about problem selection when there's all this uncertainty? Here's my theory. My theory is a rigorous framework is a framework that's agnostic or mostly agnostic, okay, to if let's say we get to like very powerful AI or human level AI, whatever that timeline happens to be. So put another way, if it happens very soon, you want to have a plan, I think, building up to it, right? If it happens, let's say in 70 years, that's fine. We still had a plan for it if it was to come, right? But like we're not working on something that's going to be obviated. The problem itself will be obviated by AGI getting here, or we have the right strategy where as it gets closer, we know how we're going to pivot and adapt what we're working on in order to better adjust to serving a world where that ends up being the case. So then that leads to this interesting question: like, what problems, what kinds of problems? Whether you're building a company today or you're building, like a company, starting a company just fresh from scratch. what kinds of problems tend to be more AI proof? And my theory there is that the closer the problem that your company is solving or that your product is solving is to the core fundamental need of a business, the more sort of AI proof it is. So the farther away you get, the more levels of abstraction you are moved away, the more risky it is, right? So I'll give you an example. You know, if you're building a tool that solves a problem for someone who reports to someone within a department, like reports to the CEO of the company, right? That's a little bit trickier. It's riskier, right? Because you don't know, for example, like of this in this entire chain, is it which jobs are going to be disrupted and like what's going to end up remaining at the end of the day, like after like we get closer and closer to like powerful AI, right? Whereas on the contrary, if you build, a system or an agent that does the job of the function itself, that's much closer to the core fundamental need of the company, right? There's a few core fundamental needs that every company needs. You have to build the product, you have to sell the product, you have to market the product, you have to keep the books, and then there's all these needs that are more specific to different industries. If you're running a venture fund business, for example, like you need to have a fund administration service. Like that's just a core need of like running a business like that, right? So the closer you are to delivering that directly, um, the more sort of like protected you are because you can build something that will benefit from AI versus you're always like fearing that it's going to right around the corner and it's going to remove the job of the person that you're trying to serve. So going all the way back, how does that apply to what's next for business SaaS, right? I predict over time, like SaaS basically what's incumbent in a lot of it. I know you guys I don't think charge this way, but like a lot of SaaS like prices per seat. And when you price per seat, you're basically assuming that the job of the person that's buying the seat still exists, right? I think as we get more and more advanced with AI over time, if we're making very quick progression, there's going to be this convergent pressure where every company that builds a tool that is serving a human within like a function or a role is going to start feeling this pressure to pivot toward building, let's say, the agent or the automated system that does the job of that human. And it's really, relevant, for example, in the CRM case, for instance, because as I mentioned earlier, like no one maintains a database for the sake of maintaining a database, right? If, for example, we had a bunch of, I don't know, like there were a bunch of VC analyst agents, and those agents were doing the job of like the analyst end to end. I'm not saying that what timeline that would happen or if it would ever happen. But if that were the case, then the memory of those systems, those agents, is the CRM, right? Like all the data you put inside CRM is essentially the memory of those agents. They don't need to have like a separate human CRM necessarily anymore. And so that's where I think things are really going. We're going to kind of shift basically from, being a very seat focused to more being like value driven, consumption driven. That's going to be a new model. I think any company today, if you're kind of building, let's say, a tool for an individual, even if that's like the right thing to be doing now, should be thinking about like what is the path as we get closer and closer, as these AI systems get more powerful, to eventually be able to mold and adapt and pivot, to eventually have like the edge in terms of being like the leading player that ends up just doing the work of that department or that person instead of building something for the person themselves. Anyway, that's a longer term event horizon. So again, it may happen in 50 years, it may happen in the next like 10 years. I'm not sure, right? But I think it's good to kind of have a map of like what's the path from here until there, so you can kind of adapt as you go.
I really agree with that. I think you said a lot of really excellent stuff there. Um, the way I almost think about this is, okay, AI's, let's say an AI agent, to use kind of a buzzy term, it's ostensibly able to act the way a human would, but under a specific set of conditions. It would make about the same decision as a human, do about the same things, take about the same actions. And the way I see it is just drastically lowering the cost, of not just getting work done, but also enforcing that work gets done. Right? If you talk to anyone who's in the management of the sales world, right, biggest complaint is I can't get my reps to update the dang CRM. Right?
Yep.
They just they just won't do it, and then I'm not able to forecast properly. um if you can make that if you can make people follow the rules around that 100% of the time, because it's automatically happening, and better yet, it's not taking an hour out of their day, it's actually just taking 0 seconds out of their day for a 2 cent agent call.
Yep.
Well, I mean, even if we don't get to the point where these things are happening automatically very soon, and these agents are acting proactively based off the CRMs being in the memory, I think that even still just changes, like you said, what you can charge, the way the unit economics work of these businesses, for sure.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. There's obviously a lot in the middle to muddle through in order to get to that like longer term thing. Actually, funnily enough, like one thing I also do believe is the pure cost value proposition, at least short term, is an interesting one. It's a bit of a tricky one with agents because the problem is if the only this is now near term, so we're thinking about like building things in the next like, year or 2 years or something. If the only thing that you're saving is cost, the tough part of the trade-off is basically for the customer buying that AI tool, they're always going to be wondering, okay, is the cost worth like the trust I have to put,
Mm.
into this new tool, right? Whereas if your, let's say your AI product or AI feature or AI tool is able to do something that a human was doing much better in some way, let's say they're able to do much more of it at scale because it's all automated, or they're able to deliver a much higher quality product, it's much more justifiable, right? It's not purely then, like a cost versus trust trade-off, but you can actually see a lot more of the value centric upside. So my prediction is that I think a lot of like those kinds of value propositions, feature sets will start to take off first. But it'll be some time. It will take some time for us to eventually get to the point where we've kind of closed that gap. And now the agents are doing all the work. I don't know. So
I remember using the initial OpenAI AIs or APIs like before they actually came out with ChatGPT. I think 2022, maybe late
GPT
2021.
2.
Yeah, GPT-2, and it was. I mean, it was a miracle, but at the same
That's
time, it
not
was
good.
so stupid that there was no way you could hand the keys to it and just be like, "All right, well, we're gonna let it make a decision for us." It's definitely covered a
exactly.
lot of that gap pretty fast. But also, I think that there's types of decisions in the business that it's totally like a 98% accuracy rate is awesome, right?
Right.
And then there's types of decisions in a business where you need not like five nines or six nines.
Exactly.
Um, in regards to it doing things better than a human, do you see any areas where these can outperform humans today?
Yeah. I'll use maybe a few, affinity examples. So, we've launched a number of like AI powered things. Two of the ones that have been most well received. We have one where I mean, maybe this is even tangentially related to what you guys, some of the stuff that you guys have experimented with at Nihilus, but we basically built a very sort of private capital oriented bot for note taking. So it's a bot, you attach it to a conversation, like a Zoom link or anything like that. It has all like we've poured all this like context about like who is an investor, what is an investment type of conversation, so that vertical context into it, and it just does a far better job, than a human, having to like scramble and take notes and everything would do themselves, especially if like given the constraint of time, the fact that like you don't have all the time to like reformat the notes you've taken and so forth, and so it does everything end to end. Like listen to conversations, take the notes, like attach it to the right profiles within Affinity. That's an example of something that you had just mentioned, like the I don't know, maybe not the five nines, but like the 98% accuracy, where uh, by default, like an action like that or a task like that, no one expects to have like perfect accuracy. Even today, like when the humans are doing it, it's like there's not going to be perfect note taking. Something that someone had said is going to be missed, right? That's what makes that kind of a use case so perfect for something like this. So I think a lot of those kinds of like use cases initially, that's where sort of the applications will, the kind of as it's finding its way through the crevices of what ends up sticking, what doesn't. Those are the nearer term things that we're going to see it sticking.
I think it's a great example. Um, it's fantastic. So overall, I think people seem to have different levels of sentiment between, somewhere between doom and gloom and like a Star Trek wonderful bright future. You seem to be a little bit more on the positive side, it seems.
Yeah, my philosophy on this actually is uh, it's kind of like weirdly tautological. It's like I don't think too much on the gloom and doom side because it's not a useful thing to think about. I put another way, if you believe there's any because okay, if you believe the doom and gloom thing, then you could say, well, I'm not going to work on anything then because like whatever we build, like it's going to be wiped away because like I don't know, control will shift over to the AI in the future or something like that, right? But my theory is if you believe there's any non-zero probability that like a doom and gloom situation won't happen, and let's say you're not working on AI safety because that's what would actually minimize the doom and gloom situation, right? Then you should assume that as humans, we're going to be able to keep our sovereignty and build things and continue to own property, and then you can kind of project into the future and think about like, all right, what does that world look like, and what does the path as we get closer and closer to the world look like, And then what are the actions that I, can be doing today or should be preparing in order to get closer to that world, to be like a winning company in that world versus, you know, a, I guess a company that loses or, isn't benefiting from like, the advantages that are created by that kind of technology. So I think, founders today, when they're thinking about choosing problems, they should think about that seriously. They should say like, hey, and Christine, you know this, like we both live this, building a company is a 5 to 10 year endeavor. Like hard problems are hard for a reason. It takes a long time for them to mature, right?
Sometimes more.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm going to say like I'm going to spend 10 years of my life, going and building something, um, like you probably want to be generally thoughtful and think about what are things that are worth working on, such that even if, this AI takeoff is very rapid, they can benefit from that transformation happening in the next like decade versus we're always like fearing or like hoping that, the takeoff doesn't happen or something like that. And it's same with how I think like, leaders should think about building their companies too, right? Like, it's probably worthwhile for, CEOs to think about, okay, like as we get closer to that world, uh, how does that potentially disrupt, the kind of problem that we're trying to solve? I don't know, maybe I'm building seat-based software. Even if that doesn't mean that I'm, starting to work on something agentic or whatever today, right? At the very least, I should be able to draw to thread the needle to say like, from where we are today, how does that evolution, as we co-evolve with these systems happen so that if, now around the corner, I don't know, the VC agent, is now possible, that we're well positioned and we're ready to adapt to go build that product. So those are like, I think the practical takeaways from it. And I think it is only useful to be optimistic and to at least plan for it. And if it doesn't happen, that's fine. You keep executing your current strategy and still build something very valuable.
Yeah,
I
that's
like
super
that.
interesting. I love that. Do you read much like Stoic philosophy, Ray?
Actually, no.
It kind of has the same takeaways as you're talking about in terms of like, if it's not something that is within your control, like it's not really worth spending time on or thinking of. It's just like wasted cycles and energy. It's
Right.
like
Yeah, that resonates.
yeah, it's same with like the AI apocalypse. Like if the robots take over, they're like, well, should we just give up? Something that I definitely like to tell people if they feel very demoralized. Oh, should we just hang up our shoes and like stop trying?
Yeah, like
Um,
what good comes out of that, right? If you think it may not happen, then you should act if it's not going to happen. And
yeah, no, I love that. I definitely see a lot of people struggling with this, like, if things are changing so fast, or like, if this is like the potential end state that we're all sort of imagining, like, how do I like get from point A to point B, or like, how do I evolve from where I am today to like make sure that I'm like keeping pace with that? Like, if we're thinking about like the organizational stuff, like, I think one thing that I'm hearing from this is that like because of this consolidation pressure, like people that are building software, just that those software platforms need to do a lot of stuff and they need to do more things over time. Like how do people kind of keep up with that and get there? Like, is AI going to make us more productive? Should we lean on that? Like,
yeah,
do
yeah.
companies get bigger? Do they get smaller? Like, where are we going with this?
I almost feel like, yeah, you're talking about two independent things. Like the AI question is maybe a bit of a separate question. Maybe to address the first thing you talked about, like, just generally, how is the SaaS, how B2B SaaS buyers, how's the market shifted, right? Like, you named a couple of things, like, they expect like more consolidation, fewer applications to do more things. Um, that's not the only one I would say. Like for instance, there's a very high sort of a bar now, especially after the last few years when we kind of came out of the ZERP era, where people don't want to buy nice to haves. Like they're really sort of focused on like what is a must have, like what is something that has to be on the P&L, and then even further they try to consolidate there. There's other shifts too. I'd say two that are probably relevant to you guys as well. Like one is once upon a time, like buying B2B SaaS, uh, there wasn't an expectation for like great user experience, great design, great onboarding, right? Like once upon a time, like enterprise software, the impression it gave in people's heads was it was like the clunky old Oracle dashboard or what have you, like that, and that's okay. That's what SaaS is supposed to be. It's supposed to be like not very usable. That's totally shifted. Like now the same kind of consumer grade expectations around like design and onboarding and so forth, like that's now become inculcated into the way that people think about buying SaaS. And then the last thing is like they expect these tools to do all of the work or more of the work for you. So, for example, the original the product insight that we had with Affinity, the idea that you could suck up all this waste data from like emails and calendar streams and relationships and use that to just populate and automate as much of like the human sort of work of using a CRM as possible. That used to be kind of a radical thing. It's like, hey, like this really sensitive data. Now it's an expectation. Now, if you talk with like, for example, most, let's say like investment firms, they would say, if you're not doing that, that'd be crazy, right? And they kind of expect that kind of automation from all the tools that they use. So I would say those are kind of like if I were to think about some of like the product or buyer expectation trends over the last decade, those are some of like the core foundational pieces. It's almost become like a industry wide or like, sector wide, like gold standard. And then beyond that, in terms of evolving, like I don't think there's any substitute just generally for like being maniacally obsessed with and close to the customer and just like talking to them constantly. Because they don't even know like, what their reactions to a lot of these like changes are, like how does, for instance, an investor versus like that uses Affinity versus an engineer that uses like Nihilist think about like, the AI question, how it plays into whatever they're building, whatever they're trying to use. They're probably very different, right? So there's no substitute for being so close to the customer that you're able to hear their psychology and how they're reacting to all these things on a constant basis.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining, Ray. Awesome insights to share all across, from building a company to where AI is taking us. And really appreciate you taking the time to come and join us.
That's it for this episode of Platform Builders. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who'd find it valuable. Platform Builders is brought to you by Nihilist, the industry standard for building communication features in SaaS. With just one API, you can integrate with Gmail, Microsoft, IMAP, and 250 other mail and calendar providers in minutes. Plus, Nihilist now offers a meeting note-taker API to help you capture external meetings, transcriptions, and summaries directly within your product. If you're building a platform and you want to offer the best in-class communications features, check us out at nihilist.com. We'll be back soon with another great conversation. Until then, keep building.